So as we're heading into the offseason with the NBA draft being only less than 2 weeks away and free agency only being a couple weeks after that, I want to look at a couple of teams that I think need or want to get to contention level, but are only like a couple of pieces away, and I think they can get it done in this offseason if they make the right moves. Now, this obviously isn't going to be a series I do for every single team because either teams don't need to necessarily be fixed or they aren't going to make a turnaround in this offseason. So, the Bucks and Suns wouldn't be considered this because I think they have close to what they need to do to win a championship. It's just a matter of retaining all the guys that they currently had. And then I think the same goes for Brooklyn. Like if they never got injured, I think they'll be fine as long as, they can retain, Blake Griffin, maybe Bruce Brown. There's certain teams, on that end where, if I think they're in a good spot, at least going into next season. And then there's teams on the bottom end of the totem pole. The Detroit Pistons, the Thunder, the Rockets, the Orlando Magic. Teams like that, where it's draft the players you need to draft, hope your guys develop, make the right moves, and you can maybe get in a position in a couple of years. So, I don't know how many teams I will do for this. I was looking, I might do around 8, but you never know. So, first team I'm going to do is the Philadelphia 76ers, and I think this is a good place to start. Obviously, the Sixers hired Doc Rivers for the past season, and, while they did secure the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, they didn't get where they wanted to go. They went 49-23, which was first in the entire Eastern Conference, but we know what happened to their problems. They lost in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference semis to the Atlanta Hawks. And the Sixers have been stuck in this position for the past few years where they'll have really good regular seasons and then just something happens in the playoffs. 2018, they were really inexperienced and young. They got beat up by a Boston team that many people thought they should beat. 2019 was the Kawhi shot. 2020 was just a disastrous season all around. And then this year, there's the Joel Embiid suffered an injury, Danny Green got hurt, Ben Simmons happened, and I'm not saying those are excuses. That's just part of the problem that happened. So, going into this offseason, they have 13 players on their roster worth $127 million. They're over the expected salary cap, which people are saying is going to range somewhere between $111 to $115 million. I believe they are under the luxury tax, so they have a couple other things to work with. They have 7 free agents who they have to decide what to do. Danny Green, Mike Scott, Dwight Howard, Furkan Korkmaz, Anthony Tolliver, Gary Clark, and Rashaan Tucker. I'll talk a bit about them later because I want to talk about the draft first. I'll also say this. Ben Simmons, I know he's the elephant in the room right now. He's essentially like a dead man walking for the Sixers. He's not going to play another game. At least I would hope he wouldn't, but I don't think they're going to trade him until after free agency has kind of subsided, so we'll talk about that a bit later. So, let's go into the draft. Sixers currently have the 28th pick, and I want to say this. I am by no means a draft expert. A lot of what I've gathered, kind of doing research for this video, is based on what, mock drafts are saying and kind of what I've heard from people who know more about these prospects, so take my opinion on these prospects with a bit of a grain of salt. I do know kind of what they kind of basically bring in terms of what they bring to the table, but I'm not a super in-depth scout who religiously watches college basketball. So, I also want to say this. A lot of times, especially when you're getting into the later first round, it's kind of a crapshoot to see who's available. Guys who were projected to be taken 20, drop all the way down to 28. And then there's guys you're oh, this guy will be available in the second round, and he gets taken before. It just happens. It's part of the draft. And also, I think Daryl Morey, there's a reality where Daryl Morey might just take best available because either he wants to use him as a trade chip in a Ben Simmons deal, or because of the depth that might be gutted in a Ben Simmons deal, he just wants to get the best piece he can. Going into this draft, and what I think the Sixers need to target is a backup, a point guard or a guard. I do have one guy who isn't a point guard, who isn't in that mold, but there's 4 different guys I was you know what, this is what I think the Sixers should target. So the first player is Miles Mcbride out of West Virginia. He is compared to as a Kyle Lowry type player, a guy who is a great passer and defender. He had an assist-to-turnover ratio, I believe, over 2, which is pretty solid. He can play both with the ball and without the ball in his hands, which is good, especially on a team with Joel Embiid and Tobias Harris, who kind of command the ball a bit more. But he can also play with it, so he can act as a playmaker off the bench, which the Sixers desperately need, even now, even now in their current state. So he's very variable, plays both with or without the ball in his hands. He's a guy you can kind of plug in, provide some defense, pass. He won't turn the ball over much. He can fit seamlessly in a lot of combinations of Sixers lineups. He can be the main facilitator in a lineup that has, Danny Green, Seth Curry, Tobias, and whoever they play at the backup 5. He can be an off-ball guard. I love his variety to what he brings. The second player is Rashaan Bones Highland out of VCU. This guy's a prolific scorer, averaged nearly 20 points a game. He's an elite shot creator who can be efficient even with a high volume. I believe he shot over 38% in college on 6 attempts. And he's mainly being a shot creator on VCU. He's not passing the ball to other dudes. So he's taking the shots. I think he averaged 10 more points per game than the number 2 dude. So had shooting splits of 45% from the field, 37% from behind the arc, 86% from the free throw line, which are, especially for the volume he had, that's great. The only problem I see with him, and the reason why I have him below Miles Mcbride, is that he's not a great facilitator with a turnover problem. I think he averaged 2 assists to 3 turnovers, so a negative assist-to-turnover ratio, which is not good. And I feel like the Sixers, currently constructed, already have a lot of guys who can shot create but can't facilitate. Shake Milton is a shot creator, not a facilitator. Furkan Korkmaz is kind of a shot creator, not a facilitator. Tobias Harris, same deal. Tyrese Maxey, kind of similar, but he still has the elite scoring talent that you'd want in a player, but his playmaking and facilitating, also the fact that he needs the ball in his hands, kind of knocks him down a pedestal, but would still love him for Philadelphia. So number 3, I have Tre Mann. Tre Mann is a great shot creator, but I have him below Highland because he suffers the same problem while not having the ceiling Highland has. He suffers from a poor assist-to-turnover ratio. Not as bad as Highland's, but still not good. It's nearly 3.5 assists to 3 turnovers, which isn't great. He is an elite three-point shooter. He was a great three-point shooter, shooting over 40% from behind the arc. And he does have the shot-creating ability, but I think his size, standing at 6'4" and under 180 pounds, kind of limits his game defensively. So I think his ceiling isn't as high as an Rashaan Highland's, in my opinion. He can create separation. He has a great jump shot. But I just think his size, and from what I've researched on, ceiling's lower than Rashaan Highland's, in my opinion. So now number 4, this guy is an outlier. I think I like his game overall more than Tre Mann, just a bit, but I think his game isn't what the Sixers need, and that's Joshua Primio out of Alabama. Like I said before, I'd want the Sixers to get a shot creator because of the uncertainty of the roster makeover next year. There's a reality where, whoever's going to come in, whatever guard's going to come in, they're going to be the number 2 point guard off the bench. Joshua Primio out of Alabama, he's a great off-ball player. He comes from Alabama, who last season had a lot of playmakers, so he was a great off-ball player, not even just in terms of, movement along the perimeter in terms of three-pointers, but he was also an elite cutter. Also, he should be able to translate his game to any NBA offense because Alabama runs the most similar NBA style offense in terms of their pacing and their three-point shooting. So it's not like his game is going to be adjusting that much. He shot 38% from behind the arc on 6 attempts. He has great size and versatility as a defender. He can guard 1 to 3. He even was able to guard some 4s. He only serves as an off-ball player. He did show some playmaking potential at the Combine, making a nice couple of passes, but he obviously wasn't the main playmaker. You had guys like Herbert Jones, Javon Quinterly, Jaden Shackelford, who were more running the offense. In that sense, Primio ranked 7th on the team in assists per game at just under 1. So, he really wasn't. He was more of an off-ball player, and for the Sixers, they need to bring in another guy who can shot create because the main problem with the Sixers, and kind of one of the main reasons why they struggled or they lost in the Atlanta series, they only had one good playmaker, and that was Ben Simmons. And then especially in the fourth quarter, he wasn't playmaking. So you had Joel Embiid running the offense, which isn't ideal. And then when Doc Rivers would bring his bench lineup, they didn't really have facilitators. It was kind of guys just like trying to shot create, but they couldn't set up they couldn't set up other people. So I like Joshua Premio as a prospect. From what I've researched myself, they need a guy who can shot create and play make. Joshua Premio can't do that, but he's a good alternative number 4. So that was the draft, and now let's go into free agency. Like I said, the Sixers currently have 7 free agents on their roster. It is Mike Scott, Danny Green, Dwight Howard, Furkan Korkmaz, Anthony Tolliver, Gary Clark, and Rashaan Tucker. So let's get the easy guys out of the way. Mike Scott is definitely walking. I think Anthony Tolliver will follow suit. Gary Clark, I think, will either walk or sign a 2-way deal, but I think it's less likely than Rashaan Tucker signing a G League / two-way deal because he's younger than Gary Clark and he's kind of been hyped up more by the Sixers organization. So I think Scott and Tolliver walk definitely. I think Gary Clark probably does, and Rashaan Tucker's brought back on a 2-way deal or a G League contract. Okay, so that leaves Danny Green, Furkan Korkmaz, and Dwight Howard. Let's start with Danny Green. So Danny Green, they have his early bird rights, so they can pay him $15.4 million a year. The money isn't an issue, I believe, and I think they have all the reason in the world to re-sign Danny Green. You know, say what you will about what happened in the playoffs. Danny Green was really good for this team in the regular season because you could just tell his impact and his presence. While he wasn't maybe the most consistent all the time, he was still very reliable, and I don't think there's a coincidence that you bring in a guy like Danny Green who's won multiple championships on multiple teams, and, you know, this team just plays better when he's on the floor. I'm not saying this is an excuse. I'm saying that if he was healthy for all the Atlanta series, he played in 3 of the games, I think the Sixers win that series. Is an excuse for them dropping the final 4 games, especially games 5 and 7? No, I don't think it is. But I'm saying if he played in those games, you're looking at an entirely different situation. So there's that. Just re-sign him. He's a great 3-and-D guy. I know he gets clowned on a bit too much, especially last year he got clowned on a bit too much, but I think he's great for this team. The Sixers really need guys like him on their roster. Keep him. So next is Furkan Korkmaz. Furkan Korkmaz is interesting. So the Sixers have his bird rights, which means they can pay him anything to stay on their roster. Obviously, they won't pay him anything, but you know they'll pay him. They can pay him whatever they want. So Furkan Korkmaz is a very inconsistent player, and that is obviously not a good thing. There are games where he's really hot and he's dropping 20, 30 points and making a bunch of threes. Then there are other games, like in the playoffs, where he's basically unplayable because if he's not doing anything offensively, he's literally a negative on the court. So now you have to start asking the question, what's the ceiling with Furkan Korkmaz on the roster? Right now, it's looking towards he's like a fringe bench player on a playoff team. Maybe he's like the 8th or 9th guy. I mean, with Doc Rivers as head coach, he'll probably always somehow play in the playoffs, but that's an entirely different conversation. But his ceiling isn't that high. So you might be thinking, well, if his ceiling isn't as high as you want it to be, why give him money, give him a decent amount of money when you have Isaiah Joe on your roster who, while he hasn't proven a whole lot, you know, he is entering his 2nd season, and he's much cheaper than Furkan Korkmaz would be, or at least by a good margin. And then you could pursue a wing in the draft if you really want to. And you also have Matisse Thybulle still on your roster as of right now. So it's not like they desperately need Furkan Korkmaz. And I could see a situation where, even though I think his expected value is going to be somewhere between like 6 to 10 mil, you might have a team that's really young who just says, hey, we like the potential this guy shows. You know, maybe your wing players aren't the greatest, and you're like, throw a flyer out for Furkan Korkmaz for 12 mil. If I'm the Sixers, I wouldn't take that. I think that's an overpay for him. So, I should say this. By all accounts, he has a desire to returning. So, I think if it came down to it, I think he would take a discount to remain in Philly. It's just the issue of how much would the Sixers be willing to shell out. I wouldn't pay him more than like 8 mil, maybe 10 mil's a stretch, but You have to allocate your resources a bit better, and Furkan Korkmaz's ceiling just isn't that high. I don't think he's ever really going to be more than a fringe bench player on a playoff team. So, there's that. And then Dwight Howard, I love the guy. I think he's finally getting his praise for all he did in Orlando now, after like a decade long of people forgetting about him. But the truth of the matter is that he is not a backup 5. He's not a backup 5 you can play in the playoffs. I think he's too aggressive to a fault, if that makes any sense. If you watch Sixers games, you get what I'm saying. He gets into foul trouble a lot. Some of that's on him. I feel like a lot of times he's also kind of targeted by the refs. But regardless, he is not a positive, at least on the Sixers team, in the playoffs. And if you watch the Hawks series, you knew once Joel Embiid came out and Dwight Howard came in, they were a significantly worse team. Dwight couldn't guard the pick and roll, and John Collins and Clint Capella ate up the paint with Dwight Howard in. Great offensive rebounder. Guy's a future Hall of Famer. Just not it for the Sixers team. If he wants to come back as like a 15th man on the bench for a minimum, cool. But I've heard that he wants to still be in the NBA for 5 years and he wants to be an impactful player. I don't think he should fit on the Sixers. So, if I had to break it down, I think Danny Green is close to a lock to re-signing. Furkan Korkmaz is like slightly over 50-50, like 60%, and I don't think Dwight Howard's going to re-sign. So now going into other free agents. So like I said, the Sixers are over the salary cap, but they do have some money to manipulate. They have the taxpayer mid-level, which is just under $6 million. They have the George Hill contract, which they can use in a sign-and-trade, and they have the $8 million Al Horford trade exception. So the Sixers should target two positions in this offseason period. Point guard and backup 5. So we'll start the point guards. There's 2 tiers of point guards they should go after. 2 tiers I have them in. There's the high tier guys and obviously low tier. So there's 3 guys in the high tier I think that I think would be solid fits for the Sixers team. Mike Conley, Lonzo Ball, and Kyle Lowry. I'll talk about Mike Conley first because he is not as rumored to go to Philadelphia as the other 2, but I still think the fit is there. Guy's a great playmaker, good shot creator, plays great defense. I mean, he's everything you want in a point guard next to Joel Embiid. The only thing I'm not sure of, I don't know how much Utah would want to keep him. And he also has a health problem that scares me a bit. He's been injured he's had injury issues the past few years, and he's going on to his age 33 season, so it's like, how much does he have? How much until his lower body completely breaks down on him? But I like his ability as a shot maker, as a playmaker, as an off-ball, on-ball guy, as a defender. I mean, he's a veteran with experience. He's a good leader. You could see the difference in how the Jazz played without him and when he was in and out of the lineup. They didn't look like the same team they did in the regular season because he was battling all those injuries. So I like him. I just don't know if... I think Utah's probably going to want to re-sign him, and also I'm kind of scared of the injuries. So the real main debate I've seen between Sixers fans is the Lonzo Ball and Kyle Lowry situation. If I'm the Sixers, either of these options would be great, but I'm going to take Kyle Lowry over Lonzo Ball for a couple of reasons. Let's break down what they do similar. They are both elite three-point shooters, great on-ball defenders, great playmakers. In terms of fit, they kind of are seamless together. This is where Kyle Lowry separates himself. He is playoff experienced. I mean, he's won a championship. He's been in multiple playoff runs. He's a vocal leader and a team leader. I don't think Lonzo Ball is that. So he kind of brings a leadership that the Sixers desperately need. He has this toughness and this like persistence. Like, I know it sounds corny and cliche, but he has that kind of toughness that Lonzo Ball doesn't have. He brings the same things on the court as Lonzo, but he has better intangibles. Okay? Also, the timeline just fits better. Kyle Lowry, this is the best version you're gonna get him, and he matches Joel Embiid's timeline a bit more. Also, I mean, this has nothing to do with it, but I like the whole Philly thing. Kind of makes sense because, he was born in Philly, came from a Philly, played in a school in the Philadelphia area, and the Sixers were pursuing him in the 2017 free agency, whenever he was last a free agent. So, what's the knock on Kyle Lowry compared to Lonzo Ball? He is 36 years old, I think, going on to 37. And especially if you sign him to, like, let's say a 3-year contract. The question is, how many of those years are going to be great? You know, is it going to be the first year? Is it going to be the second year? Will all of them somehow be bad? I don't think they will, but it's more up in the air, like, what are we going to get from him? Lonzo Ball is going to be at least this good for the next 7 years at minimum. He might even be better. Like, he might improve more. So, but I think Kyle Lowry just fits the timeline more. He brings those intangibles that I think the Sixers really need. So the one caveat in these kind of deals is that not only are you competing with other teams in terms of, you know, trying to sign these guys, but with these guys, you have to make the money work. The Sixers can't bring on these guys just regularly. They have to involve them in a sign and trade. And if you're the Pelicans or the Raptors especially, the Sixers don't have, like, a sign and trade. Like, the big chip in a sign and trade the Sixers have right now is George Hill. If I'm Toronto or New Orleans, I think with Utah, you could take on George Hill, because I think, you know, while he isn't ideal, if you're losing Mike Conley, George Hill's kind of a guy who brings somewhat similar stuff, but just at a worse level. But if you're Toronto and New Orleans, you're gonna have to package George Hill, the Al Horford trade exception, and something else. But you don't want to run into the problem where you lose some assets in a Ben Simmons deal, which I'll talk about in a second. So you might have to give up Shake Milton or potentially Furkan Korkmaz in a sign and trade to appease New Orleans and Toronto. So if somehow they strike out on all three of those guys, which I'm going to say right now, I think it's very unlikely, but it's a reality nonetheless. There's two other lower tier point guards who I think would work on the Sixers. There's TJ McConnell and there's Patty Mills. TJ McConnell is obviously, he came from Philadelphia. He was drafted by the Sixers like 4 or 5 years ago. He's improved a lot since going to Indiana. If the stat sheet doesn't necessarily show it, he's gotten better as a playmaker. He's become an excellent on-ball defender. He's become an excellent defender, which he struggled with in Philadelphia. He still brings that grit, that hustle he had in Philadelphia. The only knock on him, which is why he's lower, he obviously isn't he doesn't have a high ceiling. Like, his ceiling isn't as high as the other guys. He's a high floor, low ceiling kind of a guy. Also, he struggles from behind the arc, which if you're playing with Joel Embiid can become a problem. Now in a bench lineup, it isn't as bad because guys like Shake Milton, Furkan can shoot. I could see them going in that avenue, especially since he was originally in Philly. He might want to come back, and I think he was close with Joel Embiid, but don't quote me on that one. So he might want to come back to Philly. There's also Patty Mills, who's more of a three-point shooter. Obviously, isn't the defender that TJ McConnell is, but if you want a guy who's a veteran guy who just knocks down shots, Patty Mills has shot like 38% from behind the arc on 6 attempts the past few seasons. He's always been a great three-point shooter. Okay, so now backup 5. So, unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that Joel Embiid will never play more than 40 minutes in a playoff game. I don't know if that's on Joel Embiid's conditioning or if that's just Doc Rivers kind of not letting him play that much minutes. I don't know, but the most minutes he played in the playoff game this year were 41 minutes in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference semis. He didn't play. I think he only played over 40 twice in the playoffs this year. So you need a backup 5 who can hold down the fort for 8 to 10 minutes. I said before, Dwight Howard can't do that, so you got to find someone else. So there's actually a lot of options available for the Sixers to choose from. It's just a matter of how much money are these guys going to make. Off the rip, Rashaan Holmes is not coming to Philly. He's going to make way too much money. I think he might make close to $15 million. I think that's a good assumption, at least on mine. Maybe 12 to 15. So Rashaan Holmes is out of the equation. Nerlens Noel, I think, is also out of the equation. I think he's just going to make a bit more than the $6 million figure. I mean, he's improved a lot as a defender. He was one of the best interior defenders of the season for a Knicks team that led the league in opponents' points per game or defensive rating, one of the two. So now you're looking at guys like Daniel Tice, Dwayne Dedmon, Gorgie Dang, JaVale McGee, Robin Lopez, Willie Cauley-Stein, but he has a team option, which I'm not entirely sure what's going on with that situation. So you got like 6 guys who I think could make around $6 million, maybe a couple of them make a bit more, but I think a lot of these guys are what the Sixers need in a backup 5, a guy who isn't a liability on defense. He's a solid defender, can crash the glass, but also can stretch the floor a bit. I mean, this is also more talking about Daniel Tice, Dedmon, and Jang. I think either one of those guys would be great for what the Sixers need. Now, I will say, if Ben Simmons isn't on the roster, shooting 5 isn't as necessary, but I'd still want a guy like Tice, Dedmon, or Jang over JaVale McGee or Cauley Stein or even Robin Lopez. But I think with the taxpayer mid-level, I think you should be able to get one of those guys. You should be able to get one of those guys. I will also talk about like small ball 5s. Well, Kelly Olynyk isn't a small ball 5, but I think he's a very intriguing option. I also think he's probably going to make a bit more than $6 million, especially the play he had in Houston. Like, once he got traded, he was averaging like 19 and 8. I think either Houston could re-sign him on a short deal, or, maybe another team is going to like take the bait and pay him like $10 million. There's also PJ Tucker, Bobby Portis, and Nick Batum. I would assume that the Clippers and Bucks would do everything they can to retain those guys. I have to look a bit in their salary situation to see, like, realistically how could they do it, but I think they would be solid options, but realistically I think the Clippers and Bucks are going to do everything they can to retain them, especially Milwaukee if they win the finals, because you'd want to keep the finals core intact if you're Milwaukee. I'll also address a couple of wings in case of like the Sixers, if these guys want to take a veterans minimum or you still have a bit of money to work with. Reggie Bullock, Bryn Forbes, Alec Burks, Torrey Craig, they're all great 3-point shooters. They bring a bit different to the table. I think Reggie Bullock is probably the best pure shooter out of them. Alec Burks is the best shot creator. Now, I don't know how much he'd be willing to re-sign with Philadelphia, given what happened in 2020. And Torrey Craig's like the 3-and-D guy, and Bryn Forbes is kind of like the bottom of the barrel in terms of those options. So, I wanted to throw those names out there. I don't think they'll necessarily get either of those guys, but, you never know. Now, let's talk about what everyone's been thinking of. Ben Simmons trade packages. I'll say this to start. Bradley Beal is not going to be traded for Ben Simmons. It's not that I don't think the Wizards would do it. I just don't think the timelines match up. Like, I think the Wizards are committed to building a competitive team right now, and I haven't really heard a lot of like Bradley Beal wanting out of Washington rumors in the past couple of years, like at least since last year. So I think they are safe at least until like the trade deadline. So I don't think he'll be traded until like February or next like summer. Let me first talk about trade packages that the Sixers should not do. First involves the Sacramento Kings. There's a couple of packages I've seen. The first one is Buddy Hield, Harrison Barnes, Marvin Bagley, their first-round pick for Ben Simmons. This is like the most lateral move you can make. Buddy Hield's a good player. He just makes way too much money. He's getting paid $20 million for the next 3 seasons, and he kind of just does what Seth Curry does, but maybe a bit better. I know they would have to take on like a kind of bad contract to make the money work, but no, don't do this package. Harrison Barnes, he's intriguing, but I don't think I necessarily like wow, Harrison Barnes, I really need him. And Marvin Bagley, I wasn't a big Marvin Bagley guy in 2017. I just think that guy needs to go. If he ever wants to if he wants to stay in the NBA, he needs to go to a team where there's zero expectations. Realistically, he needs to go to a team like the Kings, but he can't go to the Kings. And him mixed with the Philadelphia media and the fan base is literally no. Just don't know. I've seen other packages that include Tyrese Halliburton. I think Halliburton, I like him. I think he's a good, solid player. I think he can max out 80, 20 points per game. He isn't where he needs to be to where the Sixers are wow, this is going to get us over the top. I think he still has a couple of years left to improve before he starts hitting his ceiling and starts hitting his stride. I don't like it. And then with the 8th overall, I think it's the 8th pick. I don't know if it's the 8th or 10th pick. It could be a valuable asset to flip, but no, I'm not a huge fan. Next, there's a Dejante Murray trade. I don't know the full details of the package. It's Dejante Murray, Devin Vassell, I don't think Keldon Johnson's included, but regardless, please don't do that. No. Dejounte Murray, I like him. I know I've said this for like the past 3 players. I like him, but he brings the same problems that Ben Simmons does. They just aren't as obvious. Offensively, he has a very limited game. He has a very reluctance to shoot the ball. He shot only 31% behind the arc last year on like less than like an attempt per game. So it's like, dude doesn't shoot the ball. Dude doesn't shoot the ball either. And defensively and playmaking, he kind of is the same as Ben Simmons. Maybe Ben Simmons is slightly better. So you're kind of swapping Ben Simmons for a younger Ben Simmons who has a less hesitancy. Is that a word? To shoot. I like him. Don't do it. Now there's the Colin Sexton and Kevin Love packages, which Colin Sexton's interesting. I think he's very undervalued, especially in the trade rumors I've seen, but he does not fit well on the Sixers team. Like I said before, the Sixers need playmaking, and they need a guy who can play both on and off the ball, but also can kind of shot create. Colin Sexton's a great shot creator. He can't play off the ball, and he's not a good playmaker. His assist to turnover ratio, I don't know off the top of my head, is not that great. He really hasn't been a good playmaker. Darius Garland's the playmaker over in Cleveland. And in terms of three-point shooting, he isn't like that great either. Also, for the amount of times he has the ball in his hands, he doesn't get to the foul line that much. He did average, I think, like 5 free throws last year, but for a dude who's like a very ball-dominant player, it's like, I don't know. Kevin Love, on paper, Kevin Love is like the perfect backup 5 for the Sixers, but the problem is Kevin Love like never plays. In the past 3 seasons, I think he's logged like 90 total games out of 200 something. So like he's played in like at most half of the games, and he's getting in on the worst part of 30 as a big man. No, the best ability is availability, and Kevin Love is never available. Okay, I'll say this. Any other package I didn't include, like if you've seen like on Twitter or like Bleacher Report or wherever, I probably don't want to do it if I'm not going to say I don't specifically want to do it. So these are the 3 trades I think will work out for the Sixers. The first one's a bit interesting. It is Malcolm Brogdon, TJ Warren, and a first-round pick for Ben Simmons. And now I know what you're saying. Wow, Malcolm Brogdon, TJ Warren, those aren't superstars. Yes, they aren't. But the fit in Philadelphia is perfect. Malcolm Brogdon, one of the most underrated players in the league, averaged 21 points a game with an assist-to-turnover ratio of almost 3. That is beautiful. He is an elite 3-point shooter. He's very efficient, can play both with and without the ball, and he's already had the experience of playing with a guy who's very ball-dominant, paint-oriented in Giannis. And the extra caveat compared to some of the other trades I'm going to talk about, you don't have to give up any other player besides from Ben Simmons. And then as for TJ Warren is another guy who's a great shot creator. I know he had the foot problem, or he had the foot surgery this season, and he didn't play that much. But in the past 3 seasons, he's averaged almost 20 points per game. And in the past 2 seasons, he's improved as a 3-point shooter, shooting I think 40% on like 4 attempts. While, you're not going to get the superstar talent of Damian Lillard and Zach Levine, which I'll talk about in a second, you just get a bunch of guys who can shot create. And if these playoffs have told me anything, especially the Atlanta Hawks, you don't necessarily always need a big... If you just have a bunch of guys who can shot create and play defense and shoot the three-pointer, you can get far in the playoffs. And if you look at a potential lineup with those guys, you have Malcolm Brogdon, Seth Curry. This is assuming that you don't even get like Kyle Lowry or another point guard. So look, like this is the team. You have Malcolm Brogdon, Seth Curry, Danny Green, Tobias Harris, Joel Embiid, with Tyrese Maxey, Shake Milton, TJ Warren, Matisse Thybulle, and whoever you get at the 5. That's a deep team that also, like, it can switch a lot, can shoot. Obviously, you don't have that number 2 guy, which can kind of limit your ceiling, but that just seems like a great team. And you could probably flip a couple of those other players to bring in a superstar or an all-star. So I like the package. It's not my number 1 option, but in terms of a lot of the other packages for like non-all-stars I've seen, this is by far the best one. So the number 2 package is a Zach Levine, Ben Simmons swap. I don't know necessarily if it's a 1-for-1 swap or if like the Sixers will have to include picks, but whatever. I don't think a Zach Levine, Ben Simmons swap makes sense for both teams. Now, I know what you're saying. Ben Simmons is a worse player than Zach Levine. Yes, but you have to look at the circumstances in Chicago. Zach Levine has 1 year left on his contract. He's already sold his house in the Chicago area, and there's been reports saying he's just going to leave in free agency. Now, I know you're saying, well, whatever. They can just fall back on their picks. But they can't. Their 2023 first-round pick is in the Orlando Magic's hands, which means if they lose Zach Levine and bottom out, which if they lose Zach Levine for nothing, they will bottom out, a potential top 5 to top 3 pick will not be in their hands. So, if you're Chicago, you want to get back something, especially a player who can at least somewhat match the production of Zach Levine, so you're not losing your pick. And in terms of Philadelphia, the fit makes sense. Zach Levine's an elite shot maker, elite three-point shooter. I don't know the splits offhand. I think he did shoot 40-something% from behind the arc on a bunch of attempts. The only concern is that he isn't like the best playmaker, but he has been improving in that aspect. And he's also younger. He's also like young-ish. He's only like 26, so he's still got a couple years left of like peak prime Zach Levine, unless injuries happen. So the fit makes sense. You would need a playmaking guard to go alongside, but I think he'd be a perfect number 2 next to Joel Embiid. The final trade package, which is the one people have been talking about, especially with the recent rumors, is the Damian Lillard trade. There's a 3-team trade that involves Minnesota, which I kind of won't get into. I'll just talk about how it pertains to Portland and Philadelphia. It's Damian Lillard for Ben Simmons, Tyrese Maxey, Matisse Thybulle, and like 3 first-round picks. I know that sounds like a lot to give up for Damian Lillard, but if I've learned anything from the past couple of years and the way trades work, you have to risk it to go all in. Joel Embiid has 2 years left under contract. Now, I'm not saying he will leave. I think he's more than likely going to stay, but you never know. So you have to maximize his potential, which is the next 2 to 5 years. Damian Lillard is an elite shot maker, one of the best three-point shooters in NBA history. He is clutch at times, and he's also a good playmaker. Damian Lillard and Joel Embiid instantly become a championship duo. And now there is the problem with the bench being entirely gutted. But if you have the opportunity to bring on a top 10 to 15 guy in the league to complement your also top 10 player, you always do it. You don't want to make the same mistake you did with James Harden and letting him go to a conference rival nonetheless. And now you're stuck in a position. So if you have the chance to make the deal, do it. That is the number 1 trade the Sixers should do. Get Damian Lillard because you don't want him to go to the Knicks or even another team that's in a championship contending mode. Okay? So what is the breakdown in terms of what's ideal, what's realistic, what's worse? So, what's the worst case scenario for the Sixers team next season? Okay. Well, excluding Ben Simmons still being on the roster. Okay? You don't get any of the 4 players, any of these 4 top players. Okay? You don't get Lowry, Lonzo Ball, or Mike Conley. You get either Patty Mills or TJ McConnell. And I still think you'll get a backup 5. Because I think they have to get one regardless. And in terms of a Ben Simmons trade package, you get either the Kings deal or the Spurs deal. Okay? I think that's the worst case scenario. I don't think it's realistic because I think a couple things will fall their way. What's the best case scenario for the Sixers? Okay. You get Miles McBride or Bones Highland. I think one or two. I think either one of them would be best case scenario. You get Kyle Lowry, and you get either Zach LaVine or Damian Lillard. So what do I think is realistic? Okay. I think realistically, you're going to get Trey Mann. I think, especially with the way Miles McBride and Bones Highland have been skyrocketing on draft boards, I think they'll probably, one of them will at least be gone by the time the Sixers are up. So you get Trey Mann. I think Kyle Lowry's pretty realistic. I don't know if I'm being a homer here, but I think it just kind of makes sense. You get Daniel Tice or Dwayne Dedmon as your backup 5. And you get Damian Lillard. I think Zach LaVine is a bit less unrealistic than Damian Lillard, as crazy as that sounds, but that's what I think. So, let's go with realistic case scenario. So you have Damian Lillard, so Kyle Lowry, Damian Lillard, Danny Green, Tobias Harris, Joel Embiid, with Shake Milton, Trey Mann, Seth Curry, Furkan Korkmaz, and Daniel Tice at the 5. Maybe you pick up another veteran minimum guy that I didn't talk about. What is the ceiling of that team? Well, the couple things depend on, obviously. I think you're getting to at least the second round again, which I know you're saying, well, only the second round, but the Eastern Conference is very top-heavy, so you kind of have to break through and hope some things fall your way. I think you can get an Eastern Conference Finals appearance, at least, if you get great performances by Damian Lillard and Joel Embiid, which we've seen both of them do. I don't think Eastern Conference Finals is out of the realm of possibilities. NBA Finals, it's a bit trickier because it's like, well, if you somehow avoid Brooklyn and Milwaukee in the second round, you're going to play one of them in the conference finals, which, in a 7-game series, if everyone's healthy, I'm taking the Sixers would be the underdog. I think even while it's not the expectation that Sixers fans have, the reality of the situation is that you're in a top-heavy Eastern Conference. Making the NBA Finals is going to be very hard. So, that'll do for this video. I hope you guys liked the 2K gameplay in the background. I wanted to change things up visually, so you're not staring at, like, a JPEG for, like, 40 minutes. Also, if you stuck through the entire video, shout out to you. You're awesome. I hope everyone has a nice day. I want to keep doing these for the next couple of weeks, just so, right before the draft process, to get some content out. That'll do it for me. I'm out. Peace.